Imaginary arguments have a completion problem. You're in the shower, completely naked, shampoo stinging one eye, working out with devastating precision exactly why your coworker's okay was not okay. They say the irritating thing you already knew they'd say, and you answer with a sentence so perfect their entire personality files for bankruptcy. They apologize. The invisible audience recognizes your wisdom, and civilization is restored. Then your brain hits replay. You won, obviously, because you wrote both sides of the fight. But the victory never produced what the system was actually waiting for, since an imaginary opponent can't hand you a real verdict. There's just one problem: the fight never happened. Maybe your partner's tone felt off. Maybe a stranger was rude 6 hours ago and you said nothing because your brain had apparently gone out for lunch. Now it's midnight, the other person is asleep, and you're on round 14 of a courtroom drama produced entirely inside your own skull. It's easy to write off imaginary arguments as pettiness or cowardice or proof that deep down you enjoy conflict. That assumption may have it backward. Often the brain isn't practicing conflict because it wants conflict, it's trying to repair a moment of helplessness by manufacturing the control the real encounter withheld. And that's where the trap starts. A rehearsal can help you decide what to do next, but it can't guarantee what another person will say, think, or admit. Ask it to do that, and the courtroom never gets a closing time. There's no single scientific label for this experience because it's actually several things stacked together. A future confrontation is anticipatory thought. What if she says this? Rebuilding an awkward moment with better dialogue is counterfactual thinking. What if I had said that? Circling the insult and the unfairness of it looks like anger rumination. And after a social encounter, especially one where you felt judged, researchers call it post-event processing. One private argument can contain all four. Communication researchers study these scenes as imagined interactions, and diary research finds rehearsal among their most commonly reported functions. The brain grabs Tuesday's raised eyebrow, adds an old embarrassment, invents Friday's confrontation, and releases a prestige miniseries called Everyone Finally Learns Not to Disrespect Me. None of that means you have a disorder. What matters is whether the thought produces anything new. A rehearsal prepares you. A loop just charges admission again. To understand why the mind does one or the other, retire the idea that memory works like a security camera. It's closer to a box of props. Psychologist Daniel Schacter and his colleagues call this the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. The same system that lets you remember personal experiences also helps you imagine possible futures, pulling pieces from the past, a face, an old insult, the feeling of being cornered, and recombining them into scenes that never actually occurred. That's a remarkable ability. You can test drive a difficult route, a first date sentence, or whether one phrase will repair a friendship or turn brunch into the Battle of Agincourt. The simulation doesn't need to feel pleasant to be useful. A fire drill isn't a secret wish for fire, it's preparation for a costly possibility. The mind carries another editing tool. Counterfactual thoughts compare reality against an alternative. If only I had spoken sooner. If only I had noticed the group chat was in fact the group chat. Kai Epstein and Neil Rosie's functional theory of counterfactual thinking argues these what might have been thoughts regulate future behavior. A painful mistake highlights a correction. I froze when he crossed that boundary becomes next time I end the conversation. That's not wasted overthinking. That's a lesson getting compressed into a plan. So why does the imaginary argument so often refuse to end once the lesson's already been learned? Because arguments are rarely just an exchange of information. They're evaluations. They can imply you're weak, foolish, dishonest, unimportant, or lower in the pecking order than you thought. The words might be trivial while the social meaning feels enormous. Evaluation itself changes the stress response, and the evidence for that is solid. In 2004, psychologists Sally Dickerson and Margaret Kameny reviewed 208 laboratory studies and found that tasks were especially likely to trigger cortisol responses when two ingredients showed up together. Other people could judge the participant, and the outcome felt uncontrollable. Social evaluation plus lack of control turned out to be a particularly potent cocktail. Then, in a 2012 experiment, Peggy Zoccola, Sally Dickerson, and Suman Lamb had undergraduates deliver a speech, some in front of an evaluative audience, others performing alone. The socially evaluated group ruminated more afterward, and researchers could still detect the difference 3 to 5 days later with shame-related thoughts and feelings. Not just general arousal, helping explain the effect. 3 to 5 days. That's a long afterparty for one speech. Looking across the social anxiety literature, a 2025 scoping review by Aidan Flynn and K. Lyra Yoon found post-event processing showed up more often after performances than after ordinary conversations. It was also tied to negative memory bias, and performance appraisal and post-event processing seemed to feed each other in both directions. You remember the scene as worse, and the worse-looking scene buys the replay another season. Not every imaginary fight is secretly about shame. But the mind treats "what do they think of me" differently from "did I finish the task?" Threaten the social image and strip away control of the verdict, and the system keeps checking the file. That's why a vague comment can occupy more territory than a clear insult ever would. Ambiguity makes the simulator hungry. Did they mean that? Did everyone notice? Should you defend yourself, apologize, or take a very important call from the Ministry of Caves? Your imaginary opponent usually carries an invisible audience too. Your boss, your friends, your family, and a jury of strangers assessing whether you looked weak for 4 seconds near the printer. Now, a fair objection. Sometimes this really is just ego. Winning feels delicious, and fantasy gives you home field advantage. Habits, temperament, chronic stress, and learned conflict patterns matter as well. There's no single imaginary argument module sitting behind the left eyebrow. But just ego doesn't explain why the loop feels compulsory, or why it clusters around blocked responses. You stayed quiet because it was your boss, because the message was vague, because speaking felt unsafe. The action was unavailable, so the mind builds a theater where action is always available. Notice what the fantasy supplies: certainty, eloquence, status, control. You know what they mean. You know what happens next. You never freeze. The scene isn't just revenge, it's a repaired version of your own agency. Here's the reversal. You're usually not rehearsing the fight because your brain loves conflict. You're rehearsing it because your brain hates helplessness. The fantasy is an attempt to manufacture control, and because controlling another person's future reaction is impossible, the rehearsal never gets a clean, done signal. That's the trap. A tool built to update behavior is being asked to guarantee an outcome instead. Counterfactual thinking works best when the situation can recur and a specific change is actually possible. When "I should have asked one more question" turns into "next time I will ask one more question," the thought has earned its keep. But reviews of counterfactual research also find that when there's no real chance to improve the outcome, endlessly imagining the better alternative helps a lot less. The same distinction shows up in broader rumination research. In a major 2008 review, psychologist Edward Watkins concluded that repetitive thought can be constructive or destructive depending on its content, its context, and its level of abstraction. Concrete processing supports preparation. What happened? What can I do? When will I do it? Abstract processing gets stuck much more easily. Why am I always treated this way? What does this say about me? How could they possibly think that? Concrete thought tends to produce a next step. Abstract thought produces another episode. But concrete isn't a magic word on its own. In a 2023 experiment with 120 participants, Carlotta Heinzel and her colleagues had people focus on a past angering social event and ruminate in both abstract and concrete modes. Angry and negative affect climbed after both, while positive affect dropped. What exactly did she say, and how many different ways can I hate it, is concrete, and it's also not a plan. The useful question is whether the detail ends in an action or just keeps feeding the state. There's even experimental evidence that repeatedly feeding anger preserves it. In classic work by Carol Rusting and Susan Nolan Hoeksema, rumination maintained or increased angry mood, while distraction decreased it or left it unchanged. In another wonderfully strange experiment, Brad Bushman had angered participants hit a punching bag while thinking about the person who'd insulted them, and they ended up angrier and more aggressive in a laboratory task than people assigned to distraction or a no-punching control group. None of that proves imagining one comeback will turn you violent. It does show why rehearsal and release aren't the same thing. Practicing the emotional state can make the state easier to enter. Your brain thinks it's rehearsing the victory speech. Your nervous system may simply be rehearsing rage. So where does evolution fit, without turning this into one of those stories where a caveman did something once and now you can't answer an email? Carefully. Nobody can excavate an imaginary argument. There's no fossilized speech bubble above a Pleistocene skull reading. And another thing, Grog, no study proves repetitive social simulation evolved specifically for shower debates. What can be said is that humans evolved as intensely interdependent social animals. Protection, food sharing, knowledge, allies, and care all depended heavily on relationships, and reputation was never decorative in a cooperative species. It shaped who people trusted, helped, avoided, or chose as partners. The details vary across cultures and environments, but research backs its central role in human cooperation, and this 2021 review of reputation and cooperative networks is a useful overview. Noticing disrespect, predicting conflict, and preparing a response could be useful for exactly that reason, not because our ancestors dueled beside a mammoth every afternoon, but because open conflict is costly. Testing a social move internally can spare you the price of testing it with your face. Imaginary confrontation may borrow from older capacities, future simulation, counterfactual learning, sensitivity to evaluation, efforts to restore control. That's an evolutionary interpretation, not a proven origin story. The pieces are supported. The ancestral assembly instructions are not, and nobody should romanticize the past here. Ancestral people surely dealt with feuds, gossip, jealousy, in-laws, political maneuvering, and at least one guy who made every group hunt somehow about himself. The Stone Age was not a mindfulness retreat. Still, many social threats back then were embodied in local. You could see a face, hear a tone, watch what followed, seek an ally, repair the relationship, or walk away, and the event eventually generated new information. Now place that same simulation machinery inside modern communication. A message arrives with no tone of voice. It says, "Fine." There's a period. The period appears armed. You don't know whether the sender is busy, annoyed, joking, or carrying groceries, and clarification might take 8 hours. Meanwhile, the message sits perfectly preserved for forensic rereading until the heat death of the universe. Social media piles on invisible audiences, public metrics, searchable history, delayed replies, and strangers who wander into an exchange halfway through. A tense campfire conversation has become a campfire with 10,000 people standing around it, half of whom showed up because an algorithm smelled smoke. There's limited but suggestive evidence for this amplification effect. In a 16-day diary study of 106 adolescent girls, the odds of reporting rumination after a negative social media interaction were 2.08 times the odds after a negative in-person interaction. That's a meaningful difference, not a universal law, and it's still one specific sample. But online interaction is public, permanent, asynchronous, and stripped of the cues that usually resolve ambiguity. One plausible evolutionary lens for all this is mismatch. Evolutionary mismatch is the gap between the conditions a capacity took shape in and the conditions it now operates under. Social rehearsal can prepare you for a consequential interaction. Now it gets pointed at unread messages, office politics, old screenshots, future family dinners, and people whose reactions you can't observe or control. The system expects a local problem that will produce feedback. Modern life hands it an abstract problem with push notifications instead. Picture a lookout scanning one dark tree line, a genuinely useful job. Now hand that lookout Wi-Fi, read receipts, and a glowing rectangle that delivers ambiguous social cues at 2013 in the morning, and don't act surprised when he refuses to clock out. That's the proposed mismatch payoff. A simulator built to turn uncertainty into useful rehearsal now sits surrounded by situations generating uncertainty faster than action can resolve it. The brain opens a security drill, but the building has infinite floors and the alarm has a comment section. None of this means the original concern is fake. Sometimes someone really did disrespect you. Sometimes the anger is information. Sometimes a boundary genuinely needs to be set, and an evolutionary explanation should never be used to talk people into tolerating mistreatment, discrimination, manipulation, or danger with a serene little smile. A loop can start with an accurate detection and still turn into an inaccurate forecast. That crossed a line may be true. Therefore, I must simulate 600 versions of the trial does not follow from it. Not everybody loops for the same reason either. A 2024 meta-analysis found a correlation of 0.45 between social anxiety and post-event rumination, a moderate association, and correlation isn't destiny. Past bullying, unpredictable conflict, current stress, lack of sleep, and plain habit all shape the loop too. Power changes the practical meaning of just say something. A person may stay silent because the social cost is real, and a child, an employee, a marginalized person, or a financially dependent partner doesn't always have the same menu of safe responses as someone with status and protection. Sometimes the mind rehearses because reality never offered a safe stage to begin with. So the goal isn't to shame yourself for thinking or to force every thought out of consciousness. The goal is telling preparation apart from repetition. Useful rehearsal changes something. After a pass or two, you're left with a boundary, a decision, or a next action, and the scene gets simpler. Rumination just changes costumes, not information. The dialogue gets more elaborate, the opponent more villainous, the audience larger, your body more activated, while you're no closer to knowing what you'll actually do. If you catch the theater opening, try making the simulation pay rent. First, describe the event in one boring sentence using only what a camera recorded. He called my idea unrealistic, not he exposed his lifelong campaign to destroy me. Cameras are terrible at diagnosing campaigns. Second, name what actually felt threatened: respect, fairness, belonging, competence, control. The imaginary dialogue often softens once you identify the real injury underneath it. Third, ask whether a specific, safe action is available. Seek clarity, set a boundary, save a record, get support, apologize, or leave the issue alone. Keep the line short. Real boundaries rarely sound like movie monologues. "Don't speak to me that way" is 8 times more usable than the 12-minute address you delivered while brushing your teeth. Then ask the brutal question: what would actually count as finished? If the answer is "I know my next step," the rehearsal can end there. If it's "they admit I'm right, they regret their entire personality, and the audience carries me through the village," you're requesting control over another mind. And no internal rehearsal can produce that receipt. Stop supplying dialogue at that point. Shift attention, lower the arousal, and return to something concrete, not because the issue never mattered, but because the simulator already submitted its report. If these loops routinely steal sleep, damage relationships, or feel impossible to interrupt, getting help isn't an admission that the imaginary opponent won. Repetitive negative thinking is a real target in psychological treatment, and you're allowed to call in a better director. The compassionate version of this story isn't "your brain is stupid." Your brain is doing something sophisticated, building possible futures from old experience, tracking social danger, protecting your sense of agency, trying to keep you from being caught speechless again. That system is a feature. The endless rerun is where the mismatch may begin. So next time you catch yourself in the shower, shampoo in one eye, absolutely demolishing a coworker who is currently 8 kilometers away eating cereal, notice the stage. Notice the audience. Notice how generously your opponent has agreed to read the lines you wrote for them. Then ask whether you need one real sentence or whether you're trying to win control over an empty room. Take the useful sentence. Leave the courtroom, because the cave may feel crowded, but when the argument never happened, there's no rival at the entrance. There's only an echo wearing their voice. So tell me in the comments, do imaginary arguments prepare you, or do they just make you angrier? And if you want to keep understanding why your brain and body do things that make no sense in the modern world, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming.